The screech of brakes shattered the quiet afternoon in Cedar Falls. Caleb Rivers dropped his hammer and rushed outside to find her, a young woman crumpled beside the road, crimson seeping through her torn vintage dress. "Please, don't lift my skirt," she whispered, trembling hands clutching the fabric as blood pooled beneath her thigh. Her accent carried hints of somewhere far from this small Oregon town. But the wound was spreading fast. Caleb knew he had to look. When he gently lifted the torn fabric, his breath caught in his throat. There, carved into porcelain skin, was a rose. Not a tattoo, but an intricate scar, each petal and thorn etched with surgical precision. This wasn't from any accident. Someone had deliberately marked her. And in that moment, staring at this beautiful, terrified stranger, Caleb had no idea he was about to discover a secret that would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, identity, and the price of belonging to two different worlds. 3 years ago, Caleb Rivers had stood at his wife's graveside with 6-year-old Mason clinging to his leg, promising Helena he would raise their son alone. The cancer had taken her when Mason was barely 3, leaving behind a small woodworking shop and dreams that would never see daylight. Helena had been an architect with a passion for furniture design, and their log cabin home still bore her artistic touch in every custom detail. Now, at 34, Caleb's days followed the same rhythm: up at 5 to craft furniture for city clients, afternoons picking up Mason from school, evenings reading bedtime stories by the fireplace Helena had designed with river stones they'd collected together. The town knew their story, the way small towns always do, and they respected Caleb's quiet grief, his dedication to being both father and mother to a boy who still sometimes called out for Mama in his sleep. Mason had Helena's artistic eye, but his father's steady hands, spending hours at his small workbench, creating wooden animals and painting watercolor landscapes of their mountain town. The 6-year-old had adapted to their routine with the resilience of childhood, but Caleb often caught him staring at family photos, tracing his mother's face with small fingers. "Do you think Mama can see my drawings from heaven?" Mason would ask, and Caleb would nod, swallowing the lump in his throat. "She sees everything you make, buddy, and she's proud." Their evenings often ended with Mason falling asleep on the couch, while Caleb worked on furniture orders, the boy's blonde head heavy against his father's shoulder. It was a quiet life, a careful life, built around the absence of the woman who had made their house a home. The woman from the accident appeared at his workshop the next morning, walking with a slight limp, but carrying herself with an elegance that seemed out of place among the sawdust and wood shavings. She wore simple jeans and a cream sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, though she seemed to be trying to downplay her obvious refinement. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday," she said, her voice carrying that same mysterious accent, refined British with hints of something else, perhaps French or Italian. "And I'd like to hire you for a project." She pulled out a hand-drawn sketch so professionally detailed it could have come from an architectural firm. The design showed an 18th-century French armoire, complete with intricate rose carvings and precise measurements that would have taken a furniture designer years to master. Caleb studied the drawing, noting the expert shading and technical accuracy that spoke of formal training in design. Every proportion was perfect, every detail meticulously planned. "You drew this yourself?" he asked, running his thumb over the precise pencil work. She nodded, but her eyes shifted away from his direct gaze. "I'm self-taught," she said, the words carrying the hesitation of someone unaccustomed to lying. The contradiction was obvious. This wasn't the work of a self-taught amateur, but of someone with years of professional training. "I'm Rose, by the way," she added quickly, as if rushing to change the subject. "Rose. Smith." Another hesitation, longer this time, as if she were trying on the name for the first time and finding it ill-fitting. Caleb introduced himself and Mason, who had just burst through the workshop door with his backpack trailing behind him. Blonde hair tousled from the school bus ride. The boy stopped short when he saw Rose, suddenly shy in the way children become around strangers who seem important. Rose knelt to his level with practiced ease, her movements graceful and natural, as if she were accustomed to interacting with children despite having no obvious signs of being a mother herself. "What are you working on in school, Mason?" she asked, and when he mumbled something about art class, she smiled, the first genuine expression Caleb had seen from her. The smile transformed her face completely, erasing the careful composure and revealing something warm and vulnerable underneath. "I love art too. Maybe sometime you can show me your drawings?" Mason nodded eagerly, his shyness evaporating in the face of her obvious interest. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Helena's death. Not just attraction, though Rose was undeniably beautiful, but something deeper. The way she spoke to Mason, the genuine interest in her voice, the careful attention she paid to a 6-year-old's artistic endeavors. Helena had been the same way, treating children as complete people rather than smaller, lesser versions of adults. But questions lingered in his mind like shadows at twilight. Who was this woman, really? Why was someone with obvious wealth and education choosing to commission furniture from a small-town craftsman? And what was she running from that had brought her to Cedar Falls with nothing but expensive clothes and amateur lies about her identity? The mystery drew him in despite his better judgment, despite the voice in his head that warned him to be careful with his heart and his sons. Over the following weeks, Rose became a regular presence in their lives, always finding reasons to check on the armoire's progress or bringing Mason small gifts. Art supplies, books about famous painters, a wooden puzzle she claimed to have found at a thrift store but which looked handcrafted and expensive. She had an uncanny knowledge of woodworking techniques that went far beyond casual interest, suggesting adjustments that invariably improved Caleb's work. "Try angling the grain 15 degrees, she'd say, running her fingers along the wood with obvious expertise, or a 3mm relief cut will create better shadows for the rose petals. When he asked where she'd learned such specifics, she'd deflect with vague mentions of YouTube videos or library books, but her explanations never quite rang true. Her hands told a different story than her words, soft and uncalloused, clearly unaccustomed to manual labor, yet her eyes followed every cut of his saw with the intensity of someone who understood craftsmanship at a molecular level. She knew the names of obscure joinery techniques, could identify different wood species by scent alone, and once absent-mindedly corrected his pronunciation of a French furniture style with the authority of someone who'd grown up hearing the words spoken correctly. Each slip revealed another layer of the mystery, another crack in the facade of Rose Smith, the self-taught furniture enthusiast. Caleb found himself looking forward to her visits, not just for the obvious reasons, her beauty, her intelligence, the way she made Mason laugh, but for the puzzle she represented, the challenge of discovering who she really was beneath the carefully constructed lies. Mason's 8th birthday arrived on a grey November morning, and Caleb had planned a quiet celebration, just cake and a few presents in their small living room, the way they'd done it for the past 2 years since Helena's death. Rose appeared at their door that afternoon, carrying a wrapped package and wearing the first bright color he'd seen on her, a deep blue dress that made her eyes seem almost luminous against her pale skin. "I hope it's okay that I came," she said, suddenly uncertain, in a way that made her seem younger and more vulnerable. "I brought something for Mason." The hesitation in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure of her welcome, despite the fact that Mason had been asking every day when Rose would visit again. Inside the package was a hand-carved wooden robot, painted with incredible detail and jointed at every limb so it moved like a real action figure. Mason's eyes went wide with wonder as he manipulated the tiny arms and legs, making the robot dance and pose. "Did you make this?" he whispered, and Rose nodded with obvious pride. "It took me 3 weeks," she admitted, then caught herself, as if she'd revealed too much about having that kind of time to devote to a gift for a child she'd known for only a month. Caleb examined the carving more closely. The precision was museum quality, the kind of work that took years to master and cost hundreds of dollars in art galleries. The paint job alone showed a level of skill that spoke of professional training, each tiny detail rendered with loving care. His suspicions deepened, but so did his fascination with this enigmatic woman who had wandered into their lives carrying secrets like stones in her pockets. She stayed for dinner, helping Mason make spaghetti while Caleb watched them work together in his small kitchen. Rose moved with confidence around the stove, seasoning the sauce with the expertise of someone who'd learned to cook from professionals, yet she claimed her pasta-making skills came from watching cooking shows. Every explanation she offered seemed to have another, more complex truth hidden beneath it. When Mason accidentally knocked over his milk, she cleaned it up with the automatic efficiency of someone accustomed to having staff handle such things, yet she did it herself without complaint or awkwardness. That evening, after Mason had fallen asleep, clutching his new robot, Rose lingered on the front porch. The November air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Caleb offered her Helena's old jacket, a soft wool cardigan that still carried the faintest scent of lavender and vanilla from his wife's favorite perfume. Rose pulled it close and closed her eyes, breathing in the scent with an expression of unexpected peace. "She had exquisite taste," she murmured, her voice soft with something that might have been reverence. "This is cashmere from Scotland, isn't it? The weave is distinctive. And the lavender, is it from Provence? There's a particular sweetness to French lavender that's unmistakable." Caleb's mouth fell open in surprise. Helena had indeed special ordered that cardigan from a small Scottish mill, and the lavender had come from a boutique perfumer in Provence. Details he'd never shared with anyone, details that shouldn't have been obvious to a casual observer. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked, his voice sharp with sudden suspicion. Rose's cheeks flushed pink in the porch light, and she pulled the cardigan tighter around herself, as if it could protect her from his questions. I notice things. Fabrics, scents. It's just a hobby," she said, but her knowledge was too specific, too refined for casual interest. The way she'd identified the cardigan's origins spoke of someone who moved in circles where such details mattered, where cashmere and French perfume were familiar rather than exotic. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching stars emerge over Cedar Falls. But Caleb's mind was racing with questions he didn't know how to ask. Rose seemed to sense his internal struggle because she reached over and touched his hand gently. "I know you have questions," she said quietly. "And I know my answers haven't been entirely truthful. But can you trust me a little longer? Can you let me be Rose Smith for just a while more?" There was something pleading in her voice, a vulnerability that made his chest ache. Whatever she was running from, wherever she'd come from, she clearly needed this refuge he and Mason had unknowingly provided. Against his better judgment, against every protective instinct screaming at him to demand answers, Caleb nodded. "Okay," he said. "But Rose, when you're ready to tell me the truth, I'm ready to listen." The truth came crashing down on a Tuesday evening in early December, arriving in the form of 3 black Bentleys that seemed absurdly out of place on their quiet street. Caleb was helping Mason with homework at the kitchen table while Rose cleaned up the dinner dishes, a domestic scene that had become comfortable and familiar over the past month. Rose stiffened when she heard the sound of expensive engines pulling up outside, her face draining of color as she recognized the vehicles before they'd even stopped. "No," she whispered, the dinner plate slipping from her hands to shatter on the kitchen floor. The sound of breaking ceramic seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and Mason looked up from his math worksheet with wide, confused eyes. From the lead car emerged a distinguished man in his 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Caleb made in 3 months. 2 bodyguards flanked him as he approached the house with the confidence of someone accustomed to owning everything in sight, his polished shoes clicking against the sidewalk with military precision. He moved like power personified, every gesture calculated to intimidate and impress. Behind him, a younger man emerged from the second car, tall, dark-haired, and devastatingly handsome in the way of European aristocracy, wearing casual clothes that somehow looked more expensive than most people's formal wear. "Rosalind Victoria Ashworth," the older man called out, his British accent cutting through the evening air like a blade. "Game over, Princess!" Mason scrambled behind Caleb's legs, confused and frightened by the sudden intrusion of strangers into their peaceful home. Rose, or Rosalind, stood slowly from where she'd been kneeling to clean up the broken plate, her entire demeanor changing as if a switch had been flipped inside her mind. The woman who had spent weeks living simply, eating budget meals and wearing thrift store clothes, suddenly carried herself like royalty, spine straight, chin lifted, every gesture speaking of generations of breeding and privilege. It was like watching someone step into a role they'd been trained for since birth, shedding the comfortable persona of Rose Smith like an ill-fitting costume. "Father," she said quietly, her accent shifting subtly to match his aristocratic tones. "How did you find me?" The man smiled coldly, his pale eyes taking in their modest surroundings with barely concealed disdain. "GPS tracker in your Cartier watch, darling. Did you really think we'd let our $400 million investment disappear without monitoring?" He gestured to her wrist, where Caleb now noticed for the first time an elegant timepiece that probably cost more than his truck. $400 million. The words hit Caleb like physical blows, each syllable reshaping his understanding of the woman he'd thought he was falling in love with. He looked at Rose, Rosalind, seeing her clearly for the first time. The perfect posture he'd attributed to good breeding, the refined speech patterns he'd found charming, the casual knowledge of luxury goods that had seemed like interesting quirks. Everything suddenly made sense, and nothing made sense at all. "Allow me to introduce myself," the man continued, stepping into their modest living room as if he owned it, his expensive shoes a stark contrast to their simple furniture and handmade decorations. "Reginald Ashworth, CEO of Ashworth Couture Empire. Perhaps you've heard of us. We dress royalty, supply fashion houses from Paris to Milan, own manufacturing facilities on 4 continents." The names meant nothing to Caleb, but their weight was unmistakable in the way Rose's father spoke them, each syllable dripping with the satisfaction of accumulated power. "And this lovely woman you've been harboring is my daughter, heiress to one of Europe's largest fashion conglomerates and fiancée to Duke Alessandro Medici." He gestured toward the younger man, who had followed him into the house and now stood examining their family photos with polite but obvious condescension. The Duke, an actual Duke, Caleb's mind struggled to process, was everything Caleb wasn't: cultured, sophisticated, devastatingly handsome in the way of men who'd never worried about money or worked with their hands. Alessandro Medici moved through their small living room like he was touring a museum exhibit, taking in their modest furnishings and family photographs with the detached interest of someone observing quaint local customs. "Rosalind, amore mio," he said in accented English that managed to sound both charming and patronizing. "This has been quite an adventure, hasn't it? But surely you've learned whatever lesson you were trying to teach yourself." His words reduced Caleb's entire life to a sociology project, transforming months of growing love and connection into nothing more than a rich girl's rebellion. Rose's father examined their humble surroundings with barely concealed disdain, his gaze lingering on Mason's artwork taped to the refrigerator, the second-hand furniture Caleb had restored, the simple but warm touches that made their house a home. "Quite the little experiment you've been conducting, darling, living among the common folk. I trust you've learned whatever lesson you were trying to teach yourself." His words stung like acid, reducing Caleb's entire life, the man he'd been, the father he was, the love he'd thought was growing between them, to props in someone else's play. The casual cruelty in the older man's voice was breathtaking, the way he dismissed their lives as if they were nothing more than set pieces in his daughter's temporary amusement. "It wasn't an experiment," Rose said firmly, finding her voice despite the obvious tension in her body. "This is real. Caleb and Mason, they're real." But even as she spoke the words, Caleb could hear the doubt creeping in, the way her certainty wavered when confronted with the overwhelming presence of her former life. Her father laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or genuine amusement. "Real? You mean this carpenter and his child? Rosalind, darling, you've been slumming for 6 months. The novelty was bound to wear off eventually." He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen, which displayed what looked like financial reports and legal documents. "Alessandro has been incredibly patient, but the wedding is in 8 weeks. The merger with Medici Industries depends on this union. 5,000 jobs hang in the balance, not to mention the preservation of 2 family legacies that spanned centuries." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a rich girl's rebellion, it was an international business deal with thousands of livelihoods depending on Rose's compliance. The weight of that responsibility made his own feelings seem selfish and small. He looked at Mason, still clinging to his leg in confusion, and anger began to burn in his chest like a forge fire. "You used us," he said quietly, his voice deadly calm in the way it became when he was truly furious. "My son and I were just— What? Research for your little adventure in poverty? A chance to see how the other half lives before you went back to your real life?" The words came out harder than he'd intended, but the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. The feeling that everything he'd believed about their relationship had been built on lies. Rose turned to him, with tears streaming down her face, and for a moment she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with, rather than the heiress she'd been revealed to be. "No, Caleb, it wasn't like that. What I feel for you is real. What we have is real." But the damage was done. The lies had been too many, too deep. How could he trust anything she said now? How could he believe that her feelings were genuine when everything else about her had been a carefully constructed fiction? Alessandro stepped forward then, placing a possessive hand on Rose's shoulder with the casual familiarity of someone who considered her his property. "Rosalind, cara mia, surely you understand that this interlude cannot continue. You have obligations, responsibilities that extend far beyond your personal desires." The sight of another man touching the woman he loved, claiming her with such casual certainty, broke something inside Caleb's chest. He stood up, gently moving Mason behind him with protective instincts that had been honed by 3 years of single parenthood. "I think you should go," he said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his heart. "Both of you. All of you." Rose's face crumpled at his words, the careful composure finally breaking completely. "Caleb, please, let me explain. Give me a chance to make you understand." But her father interrupted with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased that his gambit was working. "There's nothing to explain, darling. You've had your fun. Now it's time to come home. Your real life is waiting for you." The confrontation continued into the night, voices raised and then falling to dangerous whispers as the adults tried to shield Mason from the worst of it. Rose's father revealed more details about their world. The fashion empire built over 3 generations, the strategic marriages that preserved family fortunes, the expectations placed on daughters who were born to be assets rather than individuals. "You were groomed from birth for this role, Rosalind," he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing business arrangements. "The finest schools, the best tutors, training in languages and arts and social graces, all preparation for the life you were born to live. This fantasy of domestic simplicity is just that, a fantasy. You could never truly be happy in this small-town mediocrity." Alessandro nodded in agreement, his handsome face showing what might have been genuine concern beneath the aristocratic entitlement. "I care for you, Rosalind, in my way, and I believe you could learn to care for me as well. We have so much in common, shared interests, similar backgrounds, compatible social circles. What could this man offer you that compares to the life we could build together?" He gestured around their modest living room with polite disdain. "Here you would be. What, a carpenter's wife in a town no one has heard of? You would be bored within a year, resentful within 2. At least with me, you would have the life you were born to live, the opportunities to make a real difference in the world. The rose scar on your leg," Reginald said suddenly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "That was your agreement to this marriage, witnessed by both our families and blessed by the Archbishop himself. The marking ceremony is binding in our social circle, recognized by centuries of tradition. You cannot simply walk away from obligations that were sealed in your flesh." Caleb's mind reeled as he remembered that first day, the intricate scar he'd discovered when he lifted her torn dress. He'd assumed it was self-harm or the result of some accident, but now he understood it was something far more sinister, a mark of ownership, a brand that declared her spoken for. His stomach turned as he began to understand the world Rose had been trying to escape, the prison of tradition and expectation that had shaped her entire life. Mason started crying then, overwhelmed by the adult tensions swirling around him and the obvious distress of the adults he loved. The sound of his son's tears cut through Caleb's anger like a knife, reminding him that whatever pain he was feeling, Mason was experiencing it too. Another loss, another abandonment in his young life. Rose immediately moved to comfort the boy, her maternal instincts overriding the family drama, but Caleb intercepted her with a sharp gesture. "Don't," he said harshly. "You've done enough." The words were cruel, harsher than he'd intended, but his protective instincts were in overdrive. His son had already lost one woman he'd learned to love. Caleb wouldn't let it happen again, wouldn't let Mason's heart be broken by someone who could walk away when her real life called. Rose's face went white at his rejection, but she nodded slowly, understanding the finality in his voice. "I understand," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The apology seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what had happened, but what else could she say? How could she explain that her feelings had been real even if her identity had been false? How could she make him understand that she had never intended for things to go this far, had never meant to hurt him or Mason? She kissed Mason's forehead one last time, her lips lingering against his blonde hair while he sobbed into his father's shoulder. "Be good for your daddy, sweetheart," she whispered. "And remember that sometimes people have to make very hard choices, but that doesn't mean the love wasn't real." She walked toward the door with her father and Alessandro, every step looking like it took enormous effort. At the threshold, she turned back one final time, her eyes meeting Caleb's across the small living room that had become the center of her world for 6 precious months. "The armoire is finished," she said quietly. "It's beautiful. You did beautiful work, Caleb." The words carried layers of meaning, appreciation for his craftsmanship, acknowledgement of what they'd built together, and a goodbye that felt like a door closing forever. Then she was gone, swallowed by the night and the luxury cars that had brought her back to reality, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the broken pieces of what might have been. 3 months passed like a slow-motion nightmare, each day blending into the next in a haze of work and worry and the terrible quiet that had settled over their house. Caleb threw himself into his craft with desperate intensity, taking on more projects than he could reasonably handle, anything to keep his mind occupied and his hands busy. The physical exhaustion helped sometimes, made it possible to fall asleep without lying awake thinking about Rose's laugh or the way she'd looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. But Mason was struggling in ways that no amount of work could fix, and watching his son suffer was worse than his own heartbreak. The boy had formed a deep attachment to Rose during her months in their lives, and her sudden disappearance triggered something primal and terrifying, a depression that went far beyond normal childhood sadness. He stopped eating anything but the bare minimum to survive, stopped playing with the toys that had once brought him joy, stopped drawing the pictures that had always been his way of processing the world around him. Instead, he sat for hours staring out the window as if waiting for her to return, or curled up on the couch, clutching the wooden robot she'd given him, while tears ran silently down his cheeks. Dr. Mitchell, the child psychologist in the next town over, explained it gently during their 3rd visit. Mason is experiencing complicated grief. He's lost his mother, and now Rose. His young mind interprets this as abandonment, as proof that the women he loves will always leave him. The words hit Caleb like physical blows, each one confirming his worst fears about the damage that had been done. In trying to protect his son from future heartbreak, he may have inflicted a deeper wound than the one he was trying to prevent. Mason began having nightmares, waking up screaming for his mother or for Rose, and nothing Caleb did seemed to help. The boy's teacher called to express concern about his withdrawn behavior at school, his inability to concentrate or engage with his classmates. "It's like he's just empty," she said during a parent conference that left Caleb feeling helpless and desperate. "I've never seen a child shut down so completely. He needs professional help, Mr. Rivers, more than you can provide on your own." The crisis came on a cold March morning when Mason collapsed at school during art class, his small body finally succumbing to months of refusing food and sleep. Caleb rushed to the hospital with his heart hammering against his ribs, the familiar smell of antiseptic and floor wax bringing back memories of Helena's final days that he'd tried so hard to forget. Mason looked impossibly small in the pediatric ward bed, his blonde hair stark against the white pillows, IV lines running into his thin arms. "He's malnourished and severely dehydrated," Dr. Chen explained with the gentle bedside manner that pediatricians develop for desperate parents. "But the physical symptoms are just manifestations of his emotional state. He needs stability, comfort, and most importantly, he needs to believe that love doesn't always end in abandonment." That night, as Caleb sat vigil beside Mason's hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of monitors and the distant sounds of the night shift going about their work, he made a decision that went against every protective instinct he had. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the only number he had for Rose, a local cell phone that was probably disconnected by now, but he had to try. His fingers hesitated over the screen for long minutes, pride and hurt warring with desperation and love for his son. Finally, he typed out a message that contained everything he needed to say in just 8 words. "Mason is in the hospital. He needs you." She arrived on the red-eye flight from London, still wearing an expensive cocktail dress from whatever event she'd left behind in her rush to get to them. But her hair was messy from the long flight, her makeup smeared from crying, and she looked more human than Caleb had ever seen her, more like the Rose he'd fallen in love with than the Rosalind who had walked out of their lives 3 months ago. She rushed to Mason's bedside without acknowledging Caleb, her designer heels clicking against the hospital floor as she took the boy's small hand in hers. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and exhaustion. "I'm so sorry I left." "I'm here now." Mason's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice, and when he saw her, he smiled for the first time in months. A weak, fragile expression that nonetheless lit up his pale face like sunrise. "Rose," he breathed, his voice hoarse from weeks of barely speaking. "You came back." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she smoothed his hair back from his forehead with infinite tenderness. "I promised I would never leave you again, didn't I? Well, I'm keeping that promise now." It was a reckless commitment, Caleb knew. How could she promise such a thing when her life was so complicated, when she belonged to a world that would never accept them? But Mason needed to hear it, needed to believe that someone he loved would choose to stay. And Rose seemed to understand that her words were more than comfort. They were a sacred vow. Caleb watched from the doorway, his own eyes burning with unshed tears, understanding for the first time that whatever else she was, whatever lies she'd told, Rose's love for Mason was absolutely, unquestionably real. Over the following days, as Mason slowly recovered his strength and began eating again, Rose told Caleb the complete truth about her life and the forces that had torn her away from them. They sat in the hospital cafeteria at 3 a.m, the fluorescent lights harsh against their exhausted faces, while she explained about the marriage to Alessandro and the business empire that depended on their union. "It was never supposed to be a love match," she said, stirring sugar into coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "Both families understood that from the beginning. Alessandro and I were compatible, I suppose. Similar backgrounds, shared interests, no messy emotional complications to interfere with business decisions. But the reality had been far more complex and disturbing than she'd initially let on. The marriage to Alessandro had been a sham from the beginning," she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves were dangerous. A business arrangement between two families who needed each other's resources to survive in a changing global market. But Alessandro is gay, secretly in love with an Italian artist named Marco, who works in his family's galleries. He's as trapped by family expectations as I was, forced into a lie to preserve both our family's empires and his own reputation in a world that still punishes deviation from traditional roles. Caleb leaned back in his plastic cafeteria chair, trying to process this new information. The handsome, sophisticated Duke, who had seemed like such a perfect match for Rose, was living his own lie, trapped in his own cage of expectation and tradition. So why go through with it? Why not just tell the truth? Rose laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of humor. Because truth is a luxury we couldn't afford. My father didn't know about Alessandro's sexuality. Still doesn't, as far as I know. And Alessandro's family would disown him completely if they discovered his relationship with Marco. The marriage was our mutual protection, our way of satisfying family demands while pursuing our real lives in secret. We were both prisoners, she explained, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if trying to draw warmth from the ceramic. Two people forced into a lie to preserve our family's empires, our social standing, our very identities as defined by centuries of tradition. The rose scar on my leg. It wasn't a willing acceptance of marriage, Caleb. It was carved into my skin when I was 16, barely conscious from medication they'd given me for what they claimed was a minor medical procedure. Her voice broke as she described the marking ceremony, a barbaric tradition practiced by certain European aristocratic families, where daughters were literally branded to show their commitment to arranged marriages. I didn't choose it. I was branded like cattle, marked as property to be transferred from my father's house to my husband's. The horror of what she'd endured settled over Caleb like a cold fog, making him understand for the first time the true nature of the world she'd been trying to escape. "But I chose to run," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she reclaimed her agency in the telling. "I chose to find you and Mason, and when I had to go back, I chose to fight." She pulled out her phone and showed him a series of legal documents, screenshots of emails, and what looked like financial records. "Alessandro and I exposed our father's illegal business practices to European authorities. Tax evasion, money laundering, exploitation of workers in developing countries, bribery of government officials. The whole empire was built on a foundation of corruption that we documented and turned over to Interpol." Caleb stared at the screen, trying to process what she was telling him. "You destroyed your own family's business?" Rose shook her head firmly. "I freed myself from it, and Alessandro too. We worked together for months, gathering evidence, building a case that would hold up in international courts. We're both financially ruined now, every asset frozen, every account seized, every property under investigation. But we're free to love who we choose." She looked directly into Caleb's eyes for the first time since arriving at the hospital. "If you'll have me. If you can forgive me for all the lies, for the way I left, for the pain I caused Mason." Her voice carried a vulnerability he'd never heard before, the sound of someone who had lost everything and was asking for the only thing that mattered. Caleb was quiet for a long time, watching Mason sleep peacefully through the cafeteria window, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of restored health. The boy had color in his cheeks again, had managed to eat a full meal for the first time in months, had even laughed when Rose showed him pictures of London pigeons on her phone. "The lies hurt," Caleb said finally, his voice careful and measured. "But I understand why you told them. What I can't understand is why you'd give up everything, literally everything, for this, for us." He gestured toward the modest world they represented, the small-town life that must seem impossibly limiting after the grandeur of European high society. Rose smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived, and it transformed her face completely. "You still don't see it, do you, Caleb? For 28 years I was Rosalind Ashworth, a name, a brand, a commodity whose value was determined by bloodline and bank balance. But for 6 months, with you and Mason, I was just Rose, just a woman who was loved for who she was, not what she was worth or who she was supposed to marry." She reached across the small table and touched his hand gently, her fingers warm against his skin. "You gave me myself, Caleb. You showed me what it felt like to be valued for my thoughts, my kindness, my ability to make Mason laugh. How could I put a price on that?" Her words hung in the antiseptic hospital air, and Caleb felt the last of his resistance crumble like sand castles before the tide. This woman had sacrificed an empire for the chance to be real, to be loved authentically rather than strategically. She had chosen poverty over privilege, uncertainty over security, genuine connection over social advantage. How could he do anything but love her back? "What happens now?" he asked, and she squeezed his hand. "Now we figure it out together. I have some money left, not much, but enough to start over. And I have skills, real skills that don't depend on family connections or inherited wealth. I can design, I can sew, I can teach. Maybe we can build something together, something that's ours." The possibility stretched between them like a bridge across the chasm that had separated their worlds. 2 years later, Cedar Falls had gained a new landmark that drew visitors from as far away as Portland and Seattle. Rivers and Rose Atelier occupied the renovated mill building by the lake, its large windows showcasing an unlikely partnership between traditional woodcraft and sustainable fashion design. Caleb's handmade furniture provided elegant foundations for Rose's clothing displays, each piece designed to complement her ethically sourced fabrics and timeless designs that had caught the attention of environmental activists and fashion magazines alike. The business had grown organically from their combined talents, his skill with wood and her eye for design creating a synergy that neither could have achieved alone. Their real pride, however, came from the local artisans they'd trained and employed in the 2 years since opening. 12 single mothers now worked in the atelier, learning skills that provided them with dignified, well-paying jobs while their children played in the on-site childcare center that Rose had insisted upon from the beginning. "Art should lift everyone up," she'd said when Caleb questioned the expense of the childcare facility. "Not just the people who can afford to buy it." The philosophy had guided every decision they'd made about the business, from fair wages to profit sharing to the scholarship fund they'd established for local students interested in pursuing arts education. Mason, now 10 years old, had become the unofficial ambassador of their unique family structure, moving between his father's workshop and Rose's design studio with the confidence of a child who understood that love came in many forms. When classmates asked why his dad and Rose weren't married, he'd shrug with the wisdom of someone who'd learned early that official titles mattered less than daily choices. "They don't need a piece of paper to be family," he'd say, echoing words he'd heard from Rose. "We choose each other every day." The insight often surprised adults, but Caleb and Rose had learned to listen to their son's observations about the world they were building together. The boy had grown into a confident, creative child who spoke 3 languages, English from his father, French and Italian from Rose, and moved easily between the artistic and practical aspects of their business. His bedroom wall displayed his latest masterpiece, a family portrait showing 3 figures holding hands in front of their workshop, all of them smiling in the golden light of an Oregon sunset. Above it, he'd written in careful letters, "Home is where we make beautiful things together." The simple statement captured something essential about their life that no marriage certificate or legal document could have formalized. The autumn afternoon was crisp and golden when Reginald Ashworth's rental car pulled up to the atelier, the modest sedan a far cry from the luxury vehicles that had announced his presence 2 years earlier. Rose looked up from the wedding dress she was hemming for a local bride to see her father standing uncertainly outside the large windows, looking oddly diminished without his usual entourage of assistants and bodyguards. He wore a simple sweater and khakis, clothes she'd never seen him in before, practical garments that suggested a man learning to navigate a world without unlimited resources. "Father?" she called out, setting down her work and walking to the door with cautious hope. He entered slowly, taking in the bustling workshop where his daughter bent over sewing machines alongside women from town, creating beautiful things with their hands rather than commanding others to create for them. The transformation in his bearing was remarkable. Gone was the imperial confidence that had once made him seem larger than life, replaced by the uncertain humility of someone who'd lost everything he thought mattered and was trying to figure out what actually did. "I came to apologize," he said quietly, his voice lacking any of its former authority. "And to see what you've built here." His eyes moved around the studio, taking in the evidence of honest work and genuine community that filled every corner. "The business is gone," he continued, settling heavily into one of Caleb's handcrafted chairs, as if the weight of his confession was almost too much to bear. Alessandro's evidence was thorough. Every account frozen, every property seized, every connection severed. "I'm living in a studio apartment in Manchester now, working as a consultant for ethical fashion companies that will hire a disgraced former CEO." The admission clearly cost him, this man who had once commanded boardrooms and dictated terms to governments. "But losing it all taught me something I should have learned years ago when your mother died." He looked at his daughter with clear eyes for perhaps the first time in decades. You were never my possession, Rosalind. You were my daughter, and I failed you in every way that mattered. Rose felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were the relief of finally being seen by the man whose approval she'd craved and feared in equal measure. My name is Rose now, Father, she said gently. Just Rose, the person I was always meant to be. He nodded slowly, as if testing the sound of it in his mind. Rose, he repeated. It suits you better than the name I gave you. Simpler, more honest, like what you've built here. He gestured around the studio where the evidence of their work surrounded them. Bolts of fabric in natural colors, half-finished garments hanging on wooden forms, the tools of creation rather than consumption. Mason chose that moment to burst through the workshop door, sawdust in his blonde hair from helping Caleb in the adjoining woodshop, and paint on his fingers from the afternoon art class Rose taught for local children. "Grandpa Reggie!" he called out, using the nickname he'd invented for this man who'd been trying to earn his place in their unconventional family through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. The transformation of the boy from the traumatized child who'd collapsed in the hospital to this confident, joyful 10-year-old was perhaps the greatest testament to the healing power of stable love. "Did you come to see the new rocking horse Dad and I made? It's for the baby center Rose is starting." Reginald's face softened in a way Rose had never seen before. The harsh lines of a lifetime spent accumulating power melting into something approaching grandfatherly warmth. "I'd love to see it, my boy," he said, standing with more energy than he'd shown since arriving. "Lead the way." As Mason grabbed his hand and pulled him towards the woodshop, chattering excitedly about joint techniques and wood grain patterns he'd learned from Caleb, Rose marveled at the sight of her father allowing himself to be led by a 10-year-old's enthusiasm. The man who had once terrified heads of state was learning to find joy in a child's simple excitement about craftsmanship. As the afternoon sun slanted through the workshop windows, 3 generations worked side by side on Mason's latest project. A miniature version of the atelier, complete with tiny furniture and fabric scraps arranged to mirror their real workspace. Caleb showed Reginald how to sandwood properly, his hands patient and gentle as he guided the older man's inexperienced fingers, while Rose taught Mason advanced embroidery techniques that would add delicate details to the miniature curtains. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd chosen to build something together, not because they had to, but because they wanted to create beauty in the world. The old man's hands, once accustomed only to signing contracts and counting money, learned slowly but eagerly to shape wood and appreciate the simple satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful. "I never knew," he murmured to Caleb as they worked together to fit tiny joints in the dollhouse-sized atelier. "I spent 70 years accumulating things, buying and selling and manipulating, but I never knew how peaceful this could be. How real." His voice carried the wonder of someone discovering a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, the radical idea that meaning might be found in making rather than taking, in building up rather than tearing down. When evening fell and it was time for Reginald to leave, he lingered at the door like a man reluctant to return to the empty hotel room that had become his temporary home. The Ashworth fortune was gone, the family name disgraced, the empire dissolved. But for the first time in his adult life, he seemed genuinely content rather than merely successful. "You know," he said to Rose, "I kept expecting you to ask for money, to want something from the old life, some reminder of what you'd given up." Rose shook her head with a smile that held no trace of regret or resentment. "The old life was about having things, Father. This life is about making things. There's a difference that I didn't understand until I lost everything and found out what really mattered." She gestured around the workshop, where evidence of their day's work remained. Wood shavings scattered across workbenches, fabric scraps pinned to inspiration boards, Mason's drawings taped to the walls beside technical sketches for new designs. The lingering scent of creativity and purpose that permeated every corner of their shared space. We have everything we need here. Work that matters, people who depend on us, a child who's learning that love doesn't have to end in abandonment. Caleb wrapped his arms around both Rose and Mason, and Reginald smiled. A real smile this time, not the practiced expression of a businessman closing a deal. "Yes," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion he'd suppressed for decades. "I can see that you do. The stars were emerging over Cedar Falls as the three of them cleaned up the workshop together, their voices mixing with the gentle sounds of a small town settling into evening routines. Mason chattered excitedly about tomorrow's plans, a school art show where he'd be displaying some of his wooden sculptures, a new design Rose was working on for a sustainable fashion week in Portland, an order of custom furniture that would help fund their scholarship program. His voice carried the confidence of a child who understood that adults could choose to stay, could build something permanent and beautiful together through daily acts of love and commitment. On the main work table sat Mason's miniature atelier, now complete in every detail. Tiny tools arranged on microscopic workbenches, mini fabric bolts sorted by color, even a little family of wooden figures standing together in the doorway with arms around each other's shoulders. It was more than a toy. It was a symbol of what they'd built together from the broken pieces of their separate lives. Not just a business or a home, but a philosophy of living that valued creation over consumption, relationships over reputation, daily choices over inherited obligations. The tiny wooden family stood as testament to the possibility of building something new from the ruins of what came before. As they walked home together under the Oregon stars, Rose slipped her hand into Caleb's while Mason skipped ahead, humming a melody he'd learned at the music lessons Rose had surprised him with for his 10th birthday. The boy moved with the loose-limbed confidence of childhood, secure in the knowledge that the adults in his life had chosen each other and him, had built something stable enough to weather whatever storms might come. They moved slowly along the familiar streets, in no hurry to end this perfect day, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own gifts and challenges, its own opportunities to choose love over fear, creation over destruction. Behind them, the atelier stood quietly by the lake, its windows glowing softly in the darkness like a beacon of possibility, in a world that often insisted there was only one way to build a family, only one definition of success, only one path to happiness. But they had proven otherwise with their daily choices, their willingness to value substance over appearance, to create something meaningful from the materials life had given them. They had taken broken pieces, a widowed father carrying grief like stones in his pockets, a rebellious heiress fleeing a world that valued her only as a commodity, a grieving child who'd learned too young that love could disappear without warning, and created something entirely new, something beautiful, something that worked not because it followed conventional rules, but because it followed the deeper logic of the heart, the radical proposition that families could be chosen rather than inherited, that love could be built rather than simply discovered, that meaning could be crafted from the raw materials of daily life through patience and commitment and the willingness to keep showing up for each other. And in the distance, barely audible over the gentle lap of lake water against the shore, came the sound of 3 voices joined in quiet laughter, the music of a family that had chosen itself, and in that choosing had found home.